There's a saying in journalism that a reporter should never become the story. And this episode's reporter, a psychiatrist named Mark Reagans, is not going to become the story, except for this little part. In Pasadena, there's a university called the California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech. It's famous for producing many of the smartest scientists in the world, including the brains behind NASA, stellar probes of the universe, and some huge, disproportionate share of Nobel Prize winners. What it's not known for is psychiatry. And if you wanted to major in psychology, you'd actually have to go somewhere else. But Caltech is where Mark Reagans went, and he became a psychiatrist. When he told me that, I thought, whatever kind of psychiatrist he became, it wasn't going to be typical. I was not disappointed. To give you some idea, the subtitle of the book he wrote is A Rebellious Guide to Psychosis and Other Extraordinary Experiences. I've always had a soft spot for rebels. Mark spent a lot of his career in non-hierarchical places, often working with the dispossessed, namely the homeless. He drives a car that's more than 20 years old. Though being a Southern Californian, it is a convertible. As perhaps another hazard of being a Southern Californian, he sees a lot of movies. But he comes away with a psychological breakdown that makes it seem like the films were made not to entertain, but to speak to the better part of our angels, to treat us. He's smart, surprising, compassionate, and he thinks so differently that when he starts talking, all I want to do is listen. Mark introduced me to Michael Stewart, whose story is the subject of today's episode. When Michael first heard Mark speak, this was years ago, he says he felt intrinsically understood, even though they'd never met. When Michael told me that, it dawned on me that there would be no better person to tell his story than Mark. I was not disappointed. Coming up on Brain Stories, a show about one of the most bewildering mysteries of the human experience, mental illness, told by people who live with it and those who support them. I'm your host, Frank Kosa. Today's episode contains mentions of drug use, suicide, and words that are not allowed on federally licensed airwaves. So listen with care.
When I drive around Los Angeles, despite all the cleanups and the sweeps and the thousands of people tucked away in shelters and hotels, I still see a lot of homeless people, refugees barely surviving on our sidewalks and parks. And if I look closer, I'm likely to see one of the hundreds of homeless outreach workers surrounded by refuse trying to help. Those workers, mostly poorly paid without professional degrees, are likely to have been homeless in their past. One of them is Michael Stewart. He's a tall, weathered 70-year-old black man with a self-deprecating laugh.
I never thought I could have this life that I have today, which is an amazing life. Humble, but amazing.
I knew him because we worked together on street medicine teams in Los Angeles. He was a substance abuse specialist, I was a psychiatrist. He used the emotional power of his past experiences to quietly but relentlessly persuade those living on the streets that there is hope. He told this story of a homeless man who once approached him on the side of a freeway and said that no one had been able to do anything to help him have a future, that he was unhelpable.
And I said, well, why is that? What kind of services are you looking for? He says, well, basically it's housing, but I have so many problems.
His first problem was a drug addiction. The second was a prison record. These made him undesirable for housing and almost untouchable to employers. But Michael knew this territory. He had spent decades addicted to crack himself.
I told him straight out, I was a felon also, and I'd been to prison once. I'd, have a record as long as his arm, but I'm working now.
The man could hardly believe it, but he went on. He had another problem. He was living with a schizoaffective disorder that came with frequent paranoid episodes.
I said, well, actually, I was diagnosed at 14.
Michael was also living with a mental disorder, sometimes diagnosed as bipolar, sometimes as schizoaffective disorder. He was never expected to hold a job or live independently.
Again, I'm working and successful.
The man shook his head, but he wasn't finished. He moved behind a tree, started to undo his belt and beckoned for Michael to come over. Michael hesitated, but his gut told him to go with it.
He says, well, okay, I have this one huge problem. He unbuttons his pants and he shows me a colostomy bag and explains that he's got this colostomy bag here. How's he going to work with this going on?
But Michael had recently had his bladder taken out as part of a cancer treatment.
And when I had my bladder removed, I got a urostomy bag. And so I ended up unbuttoning my pants and showing him. And the guy just looks and kind of throws his heads up and just asks me, where do I sign up?
The man now has a place to live.
And he's working and he's in a relationship. So that was a big deal.
Michael has the ability to reach just about anyone. I've seen him connect to people on the streets no one else was able to. It has made him one of the most valued outreach workers wherever he has gone. But how did he get there? How did he beat a drug addiction and learn to manage a severe mental illness? All of it done not in the prime of his 20s, but when he was nearly 60. This is a story of the long, hard fall and astonishing late rise of Michael Stewart.
I was born in Marion, Indiana, back in 1954. My mom was white, my dad was black.
They were childhood sweethearts who married young and had 3 boys. Both his parents were talented musicians.
My mom was a jazz and blues singer. My dad played saxophone and can drums.
It wasn't long, however, before problems emerged.
My dad was a very violent man. I remember my mom with ice on her face from it being swollen up. And my oldest brother had an intellectual disability. And he would make a lot of mistakes, and my dad wasn't very good with that either. So there was a lot of kind of violence towards my brother.
There were other things to stay out of the way of in the house.
My mom and my dad were both heroin addicts at that point. My dad had acquired his addiction when he was in the Air Force and kind of passed it forward to my mom.
After the Air Force, they made their way to California. Then one night, their dad suddenly told them to pack up, and they all moved 2,000 miles away to live with their dad's parents. Except for Mom. She seemed to have simply vanished.
We went back to Indiana not knowing where my mom was or if we'd ever see her again. I think that was one of the most empty feelings that I ever had.
Michael's grandparents did what they could and shared their faith in a God who punished those who sinned. But even as a 5-year-old, Michael didn't find that comforting.
My grandmother was a pastor in a Baptist church, and they spoke in tongues at this church, and things were a little bit strange. Just didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Michael and his brothers didn't stay in Indiana long.
We went to school there for a semester and a half and ended up coming back. When we came back to LA, we ended up in a foster home, me and my 2 brothers. I think it was about this time when I realized life isn't going to be easy. This is not a fun place to be.
In time, Michael and his brothers would get some relief. It turned out that Michael's mom had disappeared because she was picked up in a drug raid at a jazz club where she had been singing and sent to prison. After a year and a half, she got out and soon pulled the 3 boys out of foster care. She stayed off drugs, filed for a divorce, and took 3 jobs trying to make a home for her sons.
But even at that point, there was still violence. It's like my dad would come over just to beat my mom.
One day, when Michael was around 7, he couldn't take it anymore.
That was the first and the last time that I just rushed in to, just jumped on my dad's back and start punching him, and I hated my dad at this point. But I was too little to do any damage. I was flicked off like a fly, but But I remember I got the courage up to do something to help my mom,
Don't forget that courageous 7-year-old. He's still inside the 70-year-old now. In another family, Michael would have been in his bedroom, left to his own. But in this family, young Michael was forced to act like an adult.
My mom was usually out trying to work to be able to provide for us. And so I would be the one that did the cooking, that made sure that we got in bed on time.
But without child support and working 2 or even 3 jobs, his mom couldn't keep up with the rent. When they fell behind, they'd be evicted. From the time Michael was 6 until he was 18, he lived in 15 different places.
I think in all this, I was always waiting to be found out. You know what I mean? That you have a fucked up family, that your dad beats your mom, that you guys are poor and you can't stay in any one place for any length of time.
His behavior deteriorated.
There was a lot of fights back then with me protecting my older brother. And I started ditching school in elementary school. Just didn't want to be there.
School authorities responded to his ditching and fighting by beating him. Back then, that was done to disruptive boys, especially if they were black.
I would have to get swats by the thing of the paddle with holes in it so they could get it full speed before it made contact, yeah.
When Michael was 14, he moved again to another school. This time, after a conference that included his mother, the staff recommended therapy.
I think after my third visit with that particular therapist, he diagnosed me as bipolar and prescribed medication.
But Michael didn't want any part of that either.
I was into at least appearing that I knew that I had control, that I was perfect over any given situation, That made me feel like I was imperfect. And that illusion had been smashed, So I just ignored that. And I never took the medications that they gave me.
On top of everything, something new attacked.
It was about that time when I started experiencing voices also. I started getting these very derogatory voices, but it was constant. Even at night in bed, I'd just hear it, you're nothing, you're not going to succeed. You might as well kill yourself, you need to die.
9 years would go by before Michael would tell anyone about the voices. Not because he feared people would call him crazy and lock him up, but because not talking to anyone about shameful things was what Michael did. Around the time Michael started hearing those derogatory voices, things improved at home. Michael's mom started dating a man who was smart, kind, and interested in Michael and his brothers.
His name was Howard McCall, and he had a PhD in education, and he became our kind of surrogate dad. He was the one that took us up and taught us how to shoot and camp.
This nonviolent replacement dad provided the stability and caring that meant the world to Michael, which was great until one day when the phone rang.
I was about 16, 17. We got that call in the morning that he had died of a massive heart attack. And I remember laying in bed for two and a half days, just hurt. And he was a rock, And when I did get the energy to get out of bed, that was when I pursued drugs. That was the first time I did speed. Just whatever it's going to take to feel different.
Michael started using drugs regularly, most often weed. Drugs didn't just help him escape from grief. They quieted his voices, tamped down anxiety, and softened the depression. He started doing them with friends, which gave him something else he never had, a social life.
A lot of it was because I craved those relationships. And I think the drugs gave me the ability to be able to open up and be a little more vulnerable than I had been before.
When he was 24, his friend and dealer, Jerry, introduced him to freebasing, a way to create a cheap, smokable cocaine called crack.
And I'll never forget it. One day I go over to score a few ounces from Jerry, and he says, I tried it, and he had the little glass pipe, and he had the little Petri dish, and he was scraping up the flakes of freebase, and there were women there, the music was playing, everything was going on, right? It was like this perfect setting. And I remember taking that hit and had my eyes closed, my head went back, and I felt just pleasure, just euphoria. It was everything. And I remember thinking to myself, this isn't going to turn out well. This is going to end very poorly for me.
He was so right.
When I learned to smoke that stuff, all bets were off. It was like as much as you can get in your system. Everything else went out the window. My money was going to only be spent on this jewel of a drug.
So Michael now had a drug addiction and a mental illness. This combination creates a vicious cycle. The cycle can't be broken by dealing with only one condition at a time, even though that's what we typically do. Clinicians call this dual diagnosis. Michael just called it life. For now, his life was still about maintaining his illusion of control. He was smart, persuasive, and motivated to make money, even if it was for the wrong reason. And he had found a great place where he could create his own vicious cycle.
I got a job selling cars. I was making $6,000 a month, and I had all the connections. So I would go out and score for the general manager and, the finance man and da-da-da. Because we get paid on Friday at noon. And I'm like, I'll be right back. You'd never come back. Wouldn't come back for the whole weekend. Come back, borrow money from the maintenance guys, and so I could eat and start selling cars again.
Weeks became years. Both his drug use and his regrets grew. He'd promised himself as a child that he'd never become his father, losing his kids because of drugs. At 27, when his girlfriend became pregnant, life called him on that promise.
It seemed like it might have been what it was going to take for me to get back on track. I really wanted to be a good father.
But when the time came,
I was smoking crack the night that my wife was time for her to go into the hospital. So, yeah, I was high.
Michael lived with a constant craving for drugs. He'd have periods where he'd get help and stay clean for a while. But what limited control he had vanished when he was 35 and his mother was diagnosed with a terminal illness. It hit him hard. He coped in his usual way.
One of the most shameful things I did was my mom was dying of lung cancer, and she was in her last days, and I needed some way not to feel that. And I remember having her sign checks under some false pretense for me to go get dope so I didn't have to feel the pain of her, dying.
Her death started a cascade of events.
In a 3-year period, I lost my mom, then I lost my fiance to a heroin overdose, and then I lost my dad to a respiratory condition. That's when I went totally off the deep end. My depression was crazy. Voices, were everywhere. I just remember all the time, just kill yourself, you're a loser, just die. And I didn't know how to make it stop.
Michael had always been good at talking women into taking him in. But at this point, he ran out of options.
It ended up where I was sleeping in the park in MacArthur Park.
MacArthur Park was a magnet for homeless people in Los Angeles. Not coincidentally, it was also a place where drugs are easy to find. For Michael, no matter how deep the chaos and despair, drugs remained the constant. In fact, they actually saved him.
I remember once sitting on this overpass at Wilshire in the 110 freeway, and I'm there crying. I want to jump. I'd been on a week and a half bench, hadn't had any sleep. I didn't have any money, so I couldn't escape, and I'm ready to do it. And this homeless guy named Sinbad comes walking down the street as I'm sitting there. He's like, "What's going on, guy?" And he sees that I'm in such distress. And I said, "Dude, I'm just not feeling this life anymore." And I remember what he did, and he did the right thing at that point. He opened his hand, and he had a handful of rocks, crack cocaine. And he said, "Well, let's just go smoke this before you do something stupid, right?" And I climbed off that wall and I went up and smoked. That's how powerful that was. I knew that would give me relief.
Sinbad decided to get Michael some real help.
He found a payphone and called a place called Claire Foundation in Santa Monica. And I remember he panhandled enough money to get me there and rode with me there. And he was going to go too. We did the intakes, and they were going to take him in, but they wouldn't have been able to take him. There's only one bed. And that man said, "No, you need to take him instead."
It was an astonishing act of friendship. For the first time in his life, Michael went to live in a recovery program. But it didn't last. The combination of drugs, damning voices, and debilitating shame held Michael too tightly.
So it was get rid of the voices, get more money to use, and use to get rid of the shame and the guilt from doing the things that I had to do to get the dope to use again.
Michael would try 20 drug rehabs and 10 psychiatric hospitals over the next 15 years.
Well, at that point, I was pretty crazy in the streets in the MacArthur Park area, just kind of ranting and, walking into traffic. And most of the time that I was actually committed were on suicide attempts.
No matter how low he went, there wasn't a bottom. Until he reached the point he'd always feared.
I was coming to a place where I was actually going to cross the line, where I was going to lose my mind, where I was going to be that guy, barking at the moon or yelling at people or cars going down the street. Really felt like I was right there.
By now, he was 58 years old and back in the criminal justice system. He had been in prison and county jails for drug-related crimes before, but at this point, he was facing a serious sentence. He got lucky. The judge wanted to see him get help, so he gave Michael an option.
You can either take 3 years in prison, or you can go into treatment.
The treatment would be mandatory for a period of 6 months. Michael went for what he thought was the easier way.
I opted for prison because when I was done with that, I would no longer have probation or anything. I'd just be able to leave. I'd only probably spend 1.5 years and I can get out of there.
He was still trying to work the system and get back on the streets as quickly as possible. But a therapist got hold of him before he was shipped off to prison and talked him into the treatment program. He had found a unique place for Michael called River Community. It was a dual diagnosis program designed specifically for people who have a mental illness and a substance abuse problem. This actually wasn't the first time it had been recommended to Michael. But because it always had a long waiting list, Michael hadn't ever been able to get in. Unfortunately, once again, there were no beds. So Michael was sent to wait it out at a rundown social rehab that he called the lowest of the low as far as drug use is concerned, where he was stuck without psych meds, without a professional therapist, without any family. That's when, at age 58, everything he'd been trying to escape, his tangle of repressed and his perfectly apparent problems, exploded in what a poet might describe as a dark night of the soul.
And I remember waking up and something just kind of startled me awake. So I sat up on the bed, and all of a sudden I started seeing like everything in my life, all the pain, all the successes, my mom, my dad, everything that I had done, seen, experienced, just kind of just floating around the room, right? And all that I saw outside of me came into me, and I could feel the pain. I could feel everything. Then I remember just blowing all this stuff out of me, right? Just all of it's going and it's dissipating and it's no longer there. That morning when I woke up, I felt different. For 30 years, I had been living with the obsession to escape. I always used my drugs to do that. I no longer had that obsession. I don't know if this was a real event or if it was some type of psychosis, but that obsession was gone.
12-step programs would call that stopping trying to control your life. Carl Jung would call it facing our shadows. Acceptance and commitment therapy would call it breaking down the cage we build from our feelings and our beliefs. And the Buddhist Michael would call it detachment and the release of suffering. Whatever our perspective might be, the point was, Michael didn't need the drugs anymore to hold everything inside. But could he actually build a sustained recovery? Or would it slip through his fingers like it always had in the past? Michael didn't know what the next few years or months or even hours would bring, only that anything good that he built in his life, a job, a business, a relationship, never felt like it was going to last. And it never did. This time, he decided he had to change, and he staked everything on it.
My thoughts were, if I leave out of here and I relapse again and have to go through this again, that's it. I'm done. I'm going to kill myself.
On the next episode of Brain Stories, part 2 of Michael's Chronicle. It was unlikely that Michael was going to kick a 30-year addiction. Unlikely that he would learn to manage a serious mental illness. And unlikely that anything was really going to change for someone in his 59th year of life. But as painful, devastating, and dangerous as Michael's life had been so far, the hardest part was about to begin, and the results would be miraculous. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, be an influencer. Recommend it. Post about it. Get the word out any way you like. And take a second to let us know your reaction to it. Text us at 424-240-9302. Or send an email to brainstoriesproductions@gmail.com. You can get an overview about living with a mental health disorder and substance use from NAMI or the National Library of Medicine. You'll find links to both of those places in our episode notes. But check this out from the Treatment Advocacy Center, or TAC. They recently partnered on a study which found that 9 out of 10 people who live with schizophrenia and use drugs got no treatment for the drug use. They did a previous brief that found that 1 out of 8 people with schizophrenia and drug use issues got any treatment at all. These are numbers of abject failure. To change that, we need to start by getting serious about what truly works. You'll find a link to TAC's digest and the brief in the episode notes as well, or on our website, brainstoriesproductions.com. Thanks to the team that made this story possible. Our associate producer and editor was Kate Ruscosa. The episode producer was Mark Reagans. His book is called Journeys Beyond the Frontier, A Rebellious Guide to Psychosis and Other Extraordinary Experiences. You can order it from your local bookstore. Karen Given is our story editor and guiding light. Our audio mixer is Rob Byers. Our theme music comes from Paul Swartzel. The show is executive produced by Frank Kosa and Jenny Yang. And as always, thank you to our advisors and all our supporters. This show is a copyright of Brain Stories Productions and the Sam Obey Corporation. The use of this episode or any of its content in or for any form of artificial intelligence, its development or training, is copyright infringement and expressly prohibited without prior written agreement. The final part of Michael's story comes out Thursday, March 19th. See you then.